So what I want to talk about today is this topic, which is certainly has impacted me. And I think based on the numbers that we have today, it's impacted many of you. I have maybe 15, 20 minutes of content, and then I'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So I want to break down the next 20 minutes into 4 different sections. First off, let's define what is imposter syndrome, a mental framework of how to make sure that it doesn't actually impact beyond what it normally does. Like, imposter syndrome is kind of inevitable, and I'll talk more about that. But how can we minimize the impacts of imposter syndrome? And then I want to share some tactical tips, some actual things you can implement today to help you overcome imposter syndrome. And then finally, working within a team. So first off, what is imposter syndrome? I love this image of this dog. So we have this internal tool called Fabricator, which is used for code review. And so oftentimes what people will do is when they're making a code change and they don't really have a deep understanding of the change they're making, they'll include this image in the code review. They'll say, I really have no idea what I'm doing. Please give me feedback. Please tell me how I could improve this. And I love just the authenticity of that. That, if you really don't have a great awareness of what is the code doing, you're kind of just copy pasting stuff, you're matching a template. I think it's really valuable just to call that out. And I'll talk more about the benefits of acknowledging imposter syndrome, or the benefits of acknowledging that you don't have everything figured out. There's a ton of benefits in terms of trust and getting help if you do that. But what this picture is really talking about is imposter syndrome, right? So imposter syndrome refers to this feeling that you don't really belong. Or another way of phrasing it is believing that you're not as competent as people perceive you to be. So basically, it just means that you feel like you're a fraud. I can certainly relate to this feeling because I went to Stanford. I was lucky enough to go to Stanford. And I remember my freshman year, my first year at Stanford, I was able to land an internship. But literally, I had taken like 2 computer science classes. And I felt like the only reason they gave me that internship was because, hey, I was somehow able to get into Stanford and they gave me this internship. But I really had so much anxiety around, will I actually be able to add value to this company given how little I actually know? I really felt like I wasn't equipped to succeed. I felt like I didn't really know what I was doing. And I think that fear of judgment really paralyzed me. And that summer, I think, was really, really hard for me because I felt like I didn't have the support, didn't really know how to ask for help. And that's what I'm hoping, at the end of these next 15 minutes, a lot of you can have some tools in your toolkit to help overcome that paralyzing fear that I felt. And I wanted to call out also that imposter syndrome is a major issue in tech. It's not just something that me or you feel. The majority of people in tech will experience imposter syndrome at least once. So one study I read through said that around 60% of tech employees experience imposter syndrome. And I would actually say that's fairly low. There was another one that said around 80%. But the fact of the matter is that the majority of people who I've interacted with have felt imposter syndrome in one form or another. And this feeling will often come up through different milestones in your career. So when things are going well, ironically, that is a time when this fear of judgment, this feeling like you don't belong, that is often when you really feel that in a very deep way, even though, you earned that promotion, right? Or you were able to get that job switch. So you should have a bit more confidence. But I think this is something that really does plague many people in tech. And I think not only is it difficult from a mental perspective, that it might be hindering you from achieving your best work or doing your best work at your job, but I think this is also a systemic issue with tech in general. So Sheryl Sandberg wrote this book called Lean In a while ago. And in one of the chapters in the book, she talked about how at Hewlett Packard, women applied to open jobs within the company if they met 100% of the criteria listed. Men applied for the job if they met 60% of the requirements on the JD, on the job description. And so what I wanted to call out here is that, it's fairly well studied that women or underrepresented groups in tech are actually, they feel imposter syndrome oftentimes to a greater extent. And what the result of that is that things like putting yourself up for promotion or advocating for yourself, putting yourself in a position to get lucky, these are things that some people are really hesitant to do. And that has a longer term impact in terms of the diversity of background or thought on the team or the company. And so I think if we are able to really acknowledge that imposter syndrome is something that everyone feels, and it's something that we should be comfortable with and we should be able to overcome, I think that will really lead to not only a benefit personally for people like me and you, but also just broadly in the tech industry. That's the kind of environment we want to create. And so I'm sure many of you have felt the impacts of imposter syndrome. Like when I was reading through this, I was like, this feels so familiar to me. Like you're very sensitive to any kind of criticism. You have fear of failure. And so even if you have a small task, like which should take maybe an hour or two, you end up actually working way harder at that task. And you spend maybe 8 hours or 10 hours on that because you are really afraid of failing, and you make sure you dot the I's and cross the T's. And to some extent, that's good. You want to work hard. But if you're working much, much harder than you really need to, you're actually not doing yourself a favor by doing so much more than needed, right? And then the third impact of imposter syndrome is, like we talked about, you lack initiative or self-advocacy. So you don't put yourself up for promotion. You don't ask for the new project. You don't offer to lead the meeting because you're afraid of what might happen if you fail, right? And so in general, what this means is that you're not able to properly calibrate how you're perceived or what your strengths and weaknesses are because you're so afraid of criticism or failure. So now we know what is imposter syndrome. I want to talk about how can we reframe imposter syndrome into something which is less pernicious, less harmful to our day-to-day working life. And the first thing I want to mention here is that we have to be okay with imposter syndrome. This is not something that, okay, you came to this seminar or you read an article and now you have solved imposter syndrome. The fact of the matter is that most people in the tech industry are going to deal with imposter syndrome in some form or another for the rest of their career, no matter how successful they are, no matter which company they're at. And so I think if we just acknowledge that, hey, we're going to feel this to some extent, and that goes a long way in making it okay. And now we can be more productive about how we actually minimize or mitigate the impacts of imposter syndrome. So the first thing to just call out is that everyone does feel inadequate at times, right? It's not really a representation of how skilled you are or how much confidence you have. No matter if you're the most confident person in the world, you still will feel inadequate. And the reason is because change is constant, especially in tech, which is, our background. Every couple of years, you're going to have to learn and then relearn something, right? So tools, frameworks, programming languages. The fact of the matter is that the rate of change is so rapid that you have to be comfortable with not knowing everything. You have to be comfortable feeling inadequate, and there's going to be someone who knows more than you because there's just too much to know, right? So for example, in 2014, 2015, when I first started doing Android development, the language of choice was Java, right? And then in the past 2 or 3 years, Android has had a pretty fundamental change in how it's developed, because now most app developers will use a language called Kotlin, which is a fairly different language. And so your entire knowledge of the fundamental language that you're using to write Android apps has now changed. And you have to be able to be okay with not knowing everything. And you have to now go through the paces of, okay, let me figure out what is Kotlin, what is different about it, how do I get back to the same level of competency as what I was. And so I think the main thing I want to communicate here is that you should really try to reframe your attitude toward discomfort. So whenever you have like a meeting that you need to lead on your team, or a project that you're nervous about whether you can really tackle it, or any kind of task or project or meeting that you have anxiety about at work, reframe that as an opportunity for growth. So whenever you feel discomfort, train your brain to say, hey, this is now a wonderful opportunity for me to actually learn something new and grow as a technical person or as a manager or whatever your role might be. So that's how I broadly think about imposter syndrome mentally. But now I want to share some concrete things that you could do if you want to minimize the impacts of imposter syndrome. So first off, whenever you're given a task or a project at work, one thing I found is that people often don't have clarity about what exactly they're trying to do. What happens is that if you have imposter syndrome, you naturally will have anxiety around, I'm not sure if I can achieve the outcome which is desired here. And that anxiety can be paralyzing. And you actually end up not being productive, not even getting started on the problem. And so the antidote that I'd recommend if you fall into that bucket is really be precise about what is the next physical action you can take to make progress on the problem. The next thing I'd recommend for everyone, whether you're an engineer, product manager, engineering manager, whatever it is, keep a job diary and track how you spend your time. So what happens is, like on my team, I'll often ask people, okay, what have you done in the past week or month? And what was a productive use of your time? What was not productive? And most people are not really able to give me a precise or a good answer on how they spent their time. And that's really challenging, because if you want to get better and you want to figure out how to cut out the parts of your day that didn't actually have any impact. You need to be able to reflect on here's where I'm spending my time today, and here's how I am able to minimize that going forward. And the way you do that is you need to be able to write down every day, here are like the 4 things I spent my time on, and here's where I thought I had bang for my buck, and here's what I could probably eliminate. This meeting is not helpful for me. I spent a lot of time in this rabbit hole, which really didn't yield any productivity or any gains. Next time, I'm going to tackle this problem or this space in a very different way, which will save me hours of time, right? So you need to be able to have that ability to look back at what you did a week ago or 2 days ago, and then keep improving. And then finally, asking questions. And this is important enough of a topic, asking questions, that I have a separate slide for it. I love this quote by Alice Walker, a novelist. And she said, "People do not wish to appear foolish. To avoid the appearance of foolishness, they are willing to remain actually fools." And this is so apt. And I just feel like I've certainly done this. Where like, I'm just so afraid of asking a question. Like, what does an acronym mean? Or like, can you explain the architecture here one more time? Or can you explain this code change? I don't really understand it. But instead of asking that, I'd rather stay silent, because I don't want to expose my ignorance or what I don't know. But the upshot of that is that now in the longer term, I have remained a fool, right? Like I still don't know what's going on. And so I think being able to be okay with maybe looking foolish in a meeting locally, but now globally, you have a lot more context and a lot more awareness of what's happening, is so important. And I think this is really gets to the heart of being able to ask questions. And I think there is certainly a art and a proper way of asking questions that I want to talk about here. So the first thing to keep in mind is that asking a question is always better than being stuck. My rule of thumb for people is if you're stuck for more than 15 minutes, you should stop what you're doing and document what it is you're trying to achieve, what you've tried, and what is the current behavior, and then pull in someone for help. And I think some amount of struggle is good. That's why I put 15 minutes here. Like, you don't want to give up after 2 minutes or 5 minutes. You want to struggle a little bit, because that is oftentimes where the learning will happen. But once you get to 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours stuck on a single problem, you really have diminishing returns. And that feeling of, okay, I really don't know how to make progress, that can be really damaging for someone who's feeling imposter syndrome. And it's much, much more productive to be able to pull in someone who you can lean on for advice or for help. And the other thing that people don't realize is that the act of writing the question, when they are documenting, here's what I'm trying to do, here's what I've tried, and here's the current observation, that act of writing down your question will actually help you tremendously in learning. There have been many, many instances where in the process of articulating my question, I actually am able to solve it. And so that's another reason why I think if you just are stuck in your head and you're like banging your head against the wall on a particular problem, it really is going to be challenging for you to make progress. And when you actually start to get things out of your head and on paper, that is where a lot of the learning will happen. And then finally, this is something that I think people don't realize, that obviously asking a question will help you because you hopefully will get unstuck. But the other thing that happens is that if you ask a question effectively, it's actually a really powerful way to build social capital. There have been many instances on my team where someone new to the team, or even me, I'll ask a question, and then 2 other people will say, "Oh my gosh, I had that same question. Thank you for asking that. Now I can learn from your experience. Next time I encounter that, I'm just going to, do what the answer suggested here." So there's a lot of ability to build trust and social capital if you're able to ask questions in a way that's helpful for other people. And finally, I want to talk about working within a team, which is so fundamental to any kind of tech job, because anything meaningful gets done because of a team effort. Very few things are solo projects. You have to be able to figure out how to productively work within a broader team. And so I have 2 things I want to share here. First off, if you're ramping up on a new team, that is often, I have found, when people experience the deepest imposter syndrome. I'm on a new team. I really don't know what's expected of me. I don't really know how to build trust. And here is the algorithm that I want to share with you on how you can really overcome this. And I stole this from Andrew Bosworth, who's a VP at Facebook. And I've used it pretty effectively in my own team switches. This is called the career cold start algorithm, or the new role cold start algorithm. And the idea is that you find someone on the team and you meet them for 30 minutes. And then you ask them, number 1, what do they do? Number 2, what are the biggest challenges they face? And 3, ask them at the end of the meeting, who else on the team or on adjacent teams should I meet? The process, the same names start coming up again and again in step number 3. And this has 2 really powerful outcomes. Number 1, this is a very obvious way for you to get to know everyone on the team and for everyone on the team to get to know you. And what I have found again and again is that distance breeds contempt. If you don't know the people you're working with, it's so easy for them not to help you, or it's so easy for them to kind of view them as the other. And you can not really have a productive working relationship. And so if you follow the algorithm, you become much more aware of the other people. And that goes a long way in having a productive working relationship with them. And number two, this whole process will build a ton of trust, right? You're literally going in and you're saying, hey, what do you do? What are the challenges that you have? How can I help you, right? And so it's hard for people not to have some goodwill if you actually follow this algorithm. You're not asking them for anything. You're not demanding anything. You're going in and you're trying to learn from them. And so I feel like if you properly do this, you will build up a lot of trust. And that goes a long way in overcoming imposter syndrome. Because when you have a set of people around you who you trust and they trust you, you're able to do a lot more in terms of getting help, getting unstuck. And that is an antidote to imposter syndrome. And then finally, I wanted to talk about getting high quality feedback. So at the very beginning, I talked about how if you have imposter syndrome, one of the outcomes is typically that you don't really have a way to calibrate where you stand. Are you doing well? Are you doing poorly? It's not really obvious to you because you're so stuck in your head about, how you're doing. And that's like the key insight, is that ambiguity causes anxiety. If you're not sure how you're doing, that is a big cause for uncertainty and anxiety, because now you might get fired, or you might be doing really well, but it's hard for you to know because you're so worried about this perception that people have. And so what I'd recommend you do here is really seek out feedback. Rather than it being a surprise or a mystery, you should schedule dedicated one-on-ones for feedback and ask questions which force deeper reflection. So a lot of people will actually do this and say, hey, feedback is a good thing, right? Let me schedule a meeting with Rahul and say, hey, what feedback do you have for me? And that's like a starting point. But a much better way of asking for feedback is to go deeper and say, hey, here in the past week, here's an observation I had that in this meeting, I felt like the meeting didn't really go that well. And I feel like I wasn't able to contribute. What feedback do you have for me on that meeting? Or, hey, what should I start doing to become more effective? Or what should I stop doing to become more effective, right? So as you ask deeper questions like that, I guarantee you'll get much higher quality feedback because you're forcing the other person to think a lot more. And you'll be able to build up a lot more trust going forward. And that, I think, goes a long way in overcoming imposter syndrome. In terms of actual code, right? If you're a software engineer and you are putting out a code change, it's also really helpful to proactively identify areas where you have concerns or questions. So if you put out a code change and you say, hey, here's something where I really don't understand the API, someone help me with a code pointer or an article, which will help me make this better. What you're communicating is that you're open to feedback. You would like people to help you get better, right? And I think that goes a really long way in other people being able to share whatever they have, and it'll help you get better. And I think both of those, again, go a really long way in combating imposter syndrome. And then the last thing I want to mention here is, this is kind of counterintuitive, but one thing I have found which really, really helps imposter syndrome is actually helping other people, which is kind of weird because I think imposter syndrome, it's like you're so focused on like, am I doing good enough? Or am I a fraud? Or do I belong here? But what I have found is that if you really go out of your way to help that new person on your team and you say, hey, what I want you to goal on right now as you ramp up is ask me a ton of questions. Don't worry if it's a stupid question, just come to me and ask questions. And if you create that friendly environment, what I have found is that really does help you. When you start to understand how other people are ramping up, how other people view their role on the team, what knowledge do they have, that goes a really long way in helping you understand that you're not that different. You're not not everyone has it figured out, and helping other people will really help you. Even if you feel like you're stressed out, spending some part of your day in helping people, writing documentation, being a resource for other people, that can go a long way in helping you as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Rahul, for sharing everything with us. I thought it was very clear, very practical, and it's just really overall very helpful insights on how to overcome imposter syndrome. Yeah, so thanks again for taking the time to share. So the first question we got, what can help you take criticism better?
Yeah, I feel like for criticism, one thing that has really helped me is me being the one to seek it out. So oftentimes, like if I'm in a meeting and unexpectedly, like my manager says, oh, here's something that you could have done better, or here's something that I wish that you could do more of, or you could do better. I think that is oftentimes when it stings. But when I'm the one in the driver's seat and I say, hey, I want to have a dedicated one-on-one where you tell me what to do better, it's not a surprise. And I think that certainly goes a long way in reducing the sting of it. I think the other thing I'll say is that inevitably criticism does hurt a little bit, right? It's like someone is telling you to do something better. I think what really distinguishes really good engineers is what happens after the fact. And so if someone does say, hey, I feel like you're really not active enough in meetings, you can say, okay, hey, I'm going to translate that criticism into concrete action items. And I'm going to really make sure that my goal is now to say at least 2 productive things in every meeting going forward. And then what you do is you circle back and you say, hey, 2 weeks from now, I'm going to check in with you again. And I want you to tell me if I've made progress. And I think that is really what, distinguishes the best engineers, that they're able to really take that feedback, translate that into action items, and then circle back and say, hey, can you tell me if I've actually made progress on what you said? I think that kind of builds up trust, and it turns criticism, which is a negative thing, into a positive thing for your relationship with them.
As a manager or senior engineer, what are some good ways to encourage an environment that mitigates or reduces the level of imposter syndrome across the entire team?
Yeah, I like this. I think that there are definitely ways that the leadership of a team can create a culture where it's okay to ask questions, and that goes a long way to combat imposter syndrome. And there are 2 things. One is you need to have enough socialization and trust within the team where people feel like they're not going to be judged if they ask a question or they don't know something, right? And so I think it goes back to that point on you need to have familiarity or intimacy within the team to make that okay. And if your team only meets like once a month and there's really not that much cohesion, it's very difficult then to have a comfortable environment for people. So that's one thing. And the other thing I'll do is I think one thing I found pretty effective on my teams is to have sharing sessions where hey, tell me what you've learned in the past 1 or 2 weeks, and you can rotate through your team. And then I think people start to understand that, hey, everyone on the team is constantly learning.